So I thought I'd start at the beginning and ask you what experiences brought you to the University of Kent in the first place.
I'd never been really into education. I grew up as a working class kid, went to grammar school, but left as almost like a grammar school failure. I only had 3 O levels when everyone else was getting 7 or 8. I then worked for a year as a clerk in an office, and to my shock and horror, I discovered that being at work was even more boring than being at school. But a year into working full time, I dived into a swimming pool and broke my neck, and ended up in the world famous Stoke Mandeville Hospital for a year, and was rehabilitated and so on. And I then came home as an 18-year-old and lived with my parents in a local village called Borstal, which is where the first Borstal institution was. 2 years after I suppose I'd been discharged, I was kind of stuck at home thinking I was unemployable, and all the professionals that came to see me also thought I was unemployable, until one day there was a knock on the door and this very eccentric looking bloke came in and said, "Do you want a job?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'd like a job, but I don't have any vehicle or whatever. How am I going to get there?" Because there was no mobility allowance or motability or anything like that. I mean, there were no disability benefits at all. So he said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll come and pick you up in my car." He said, "I'm the education officer at the Borstal up the road." And he said, "We've had a man in a wheelchair working for us for years, and he's taking retirement, and so we've got a job set up." He said to me, "I want you to do some face-to-face work with some of the inmates who have trouble reading and writing." So I used to do bits and pieces of that. And then he said to me one day, "I want you to do some general classroom work with groups of inmates who are having trouble reading and writing." So I kind of found myself in the classroom, reluctantly becoming a teacher. I had to go to night school and kind of do extra courses, so I was one step ahead of everybody else in the class. So it was like I was teaching stuff that I'd been taught the week before almost. And then I think it was 1969, it could have been 68, the government in its wisdom decided that nobody without a teaching qualification or a degree could actually work as a classroom teacher. So my boss came to me and said, "Look, you're going to have to go away and train as a teacher or get a degree, because otherwise I won't be able to continue to employ you." One of the classes I've been doing at night school was an adult education class from what was Oxford University. And one of the courses was sociology. I mean, I'd never heard of sociology before, but it was part of this adult education certificate I was doing. And of course, I fell in love with sociology and thought, when he said, "You've got to go away and do something," I thought, well, okay, well, if I'm going to have to do something, I don't really want to be a classroom teacher forever. I'll go and do a degree in sociology. For the first time ever in my education experience, I encountered something which was actually relevant to me. It was about me, and it was about my life in a sense. It was about understanding why people are positioned in the kind of positions they are in society, how that happens, what people do about it, how they cope with it. It was the first time ever, I hadn't felt like I was dealing with abstract mathematical concepts or the kings and queens of England, who frankly, I couldn't have cared less about. So it was the first time education ever spoke to me. And it was like, I've been involved in that dialogue between learning about the way the world works and learning about my place in it ever since. Originally, I hadn't intended to go to Kent because I wanted the full university experience. I wanted to live in and so on. So I went to the University of Reading in 1971, to live in halls. I'd been kind of seduced almost by this charismatic doctor who was making a reputation for himself and for the university as being very open about him taking disabled students into Reading University, but without really thinking through what the consequences of that were. It's a very good idea, and it's a very good way of generating publicity. But unfortunately, when I got there, and I suppose I was naive at the time, bear in mind I was only mid-20s, and this was long before the social model and all that stuff, so I hadn't really seen it, any of the issues are like getting up in the morning and going to bed at night as being other than kind of my problem. But I'd assumed that there would be arrangements made for all this. And of course, when I got there, I found that there wasn't. All he'd done was told the local health authority that I was in the area. And so I was reliant on district nurses coming in the morning to get me up and to put me to bed at night. And as anyone will tell you, not just then, but even now, if you have to rely on the district nursing service to get you up and put you to bed, or assist you in going to bed and so on, there's no guarantee. You could be in bed in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could be put back into bed at 6 o'clock at night, which clearly was nonsensical in trying to live a student life at the university. And there were no such things as your own PAs and taking your own PAs at the time. And so I kind of survived and coped for about 10 days, but then went to see him and said, look, this is clearly not going to work. If there's no other sensible arrangements, I'm going to have to leave. And he said, I think you have to be honest with yourself and maybe realise that you are not up to and capable of participating in a university education. So anyway, my own health was much more important than his kind of snide comments. So I left, and of course almost had to go back home with my tail between my legs, kind of thing. And all my friends in the village and community, it was like I'd come back as a failure. But I was determined that I was still going to pursue a degree in sociology. So I applied to the University of Kent, and they offered me a place for the following year, which I took up. But as a day student, so I used to travel in from Rochester to Canterbury every day, as and when is necessary, in order to to do my degree. So that's how Kent and I came to kind of meet, so to speak.
But there was no real conversation about making Kent more accessible.
Not at all. I mean, I kind of internalised that my not being able to walk was my problem and not an access problem. And so, there was no question of changing the timetable so that lectures would go on in an accessible venue. I just went wherever I was timetabled. And I do have to say, because I was a lot younger, a lot lighter, and I was using a manual wheelchair then, but it was much easier for me to be lifted up and down steps. But I got everywhere in, Rutherford or Elliot or whatever. And students would always, I never found that, I was sitting at the bottom of steps waiting for ages for people to assist or whatever. But again, I had kind of learnt to be fairly assertive about that, and not to be afraid to approach people and to be very much still in charge. Like, I knew how I needed to be lifted. I knew how many people I wanted. And they had to do it my way. And in a sense, I'd already developed that skill of, this is me, this is my responsibility. All you're doing is being my arms and legs, if you like. So, but it worked really well for the whole of the 3 years that I was an undergraduate. I never really ever I never missed anything I wanted to go to. and I never found that I was, ignored or left to, not to be able to get to places that I could. And I wouldn't have known who to contact, apart from Dave Reason, who I did know because he taught one of my seminar groups. There was nobody else in the university. There was no named person in the university, a disability access officer. One of the issues that I faced very early, I was allocated to Rutherford College. I'm never quite sure why, but even getting my post was a nightmare because quite often I wouldn't need to go into the college for a lecture. I just need to collect my post, say, on any particular day. And on a rainy, wet December morning, trying to collect your post from Rutherford when you've got to go up steps and then across a causeway and so on. And sometimes I used to, rather than do that, just get somebody who was going into the college to pop in to the Porter's Lodge and collect my mail and bring it back out to me. Things like that, happened all the time. So quite often I'd be soaked before I got anywhere. But it never, ever, in my impairment consciousness phase, occurred to me to say, can I please have my mail transferred to Keynes, where I could get in with no access problems at all. And it wasn't until I became a postgraduate student when I was allocated to Keynes, because that's where all the social science postgraduates went anyway, and I started getting my mail in Keynes, that why didn't I ask for that to happen in the first place, It just wasn't part of the way we thought about disability then. But I think, I talked about the skills of being in charge, but I also learned the skills about arriving at these things early so that you're not getting people who are rushing in and they're 2 minutes late. And I learnt those skills when I used to go to London, either, to attend courses or just to socialise, or where I would drive up in my hand-controlled car. I would then need to get somebody on the street to get my wheelchair out for me. And I learnt to be careful about who I selected. I learnt that the hard way one day in Tottenham Court Road, where there were these 4 young men were walking by, and I thought, well, they look fit and healthy, and I'm sure that they'll be willing to help me. But they turned out to be drunken Scottish football supporters, and all 5 of us ended rolling around the pavement in Tottenham Court Road. So, I learned that kind of lesson, that if you want people to do it, you have to be in charge of what you want, but you have to be selective and sensitive about who you ask and when you ask. The first day I arrived on campus, and again, you have to remember, no blue badges, no reserved disabled parking space. There was an issue of where I would park. I needed to go to the Cornwallis Lecture Theatre, and the nearest place it appeared that I could park was outside the library in the loading bay at the rear of the library. So I was about to kind of pull in there when the library porter came out and said to me, can I help you? And I said, well, yeah, I'm looking for somewhere to park. And he said, well, you can't park here. And so I said, well, I'm a wheelchair user. I need to be able to park reasonably close. And he said, oh, okay, well, he said, park here. He said, I'm quite happy for you to park here if you'll leave your keys with me, so that if necessary, I get a particularly large lorry or heavy load, I can move out of the way so that we can unload it. And then you can collect your keys from me when it's time to go, which was great because it also killed another bird or 2 birds with one stone, because he would then lift my wheelchair out and into the car. I was fortunate in that the library had provided me with a room where I could study and use my books and so on as well. So I had this perfect base for the whole of the time that I was an undergraduate and a postgraduate. And it worked really well. And Fred was absolutely wonderful. In fact, when I got my PhD, I dedicated my PhD to him because it made my life so much easier, really. I'm amazed, John Joe, at just how different this is from what it was
Yeah.
like in the 1970s. So I used to come down here, swing over there. Fred used to come out, get my chair out, and then I'd go in. You know, there were several times, well, in fact, many times when I'd be up on whatever it was, the third or the fourth floor, wanting to come down and go home, and somebody elsewhere had used the lift but hadn't slammed both doors properly, and so the lift wouldn't work. And so I was then either kind of shouting down or grabbing somebody who was on their way down to say, can you ask somebody to shut the lift doors properly? Yes, this is the Rutherford I knew and loved. Same old steps.
Same old steps.
I recognise them.
I mean, there's a ramp. You can go up this ramp over here
Really?
now, which is helpful. But I mean, when you were here, this is where you'd stay, right? You'd sit here.
I would sit here
Yeah.
and get someone to go to the Porter's Lodge and
Yep.
come back. If I wanted to get into Rutherford, I would go all the way down there and down to the little roundabout and go in.
Like in the car park.
In the back entrance, yeah, through the car.
Right. We are. How was that?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. One of the sociology lecturers had his room was up in one of the tower blocks, and I used to
Okay.
go up there regularly for a
Okay.
Tuesday afternoon seminar. It never occurred to me to say, can you hold it somewhere else, or
Oh yeah.
can you borrow somebody else's room or whatever, and it never occurred to him either. I think he just kind of thought I floated up there or whatever, but it wasn't an
But
issue.
none of it was unaided, right? Some people were helping you up there.
No, I'd sit at the bottom of the stairs, like those stairs over there, and then, you know, when 3 or 4 students came by, I would say, can you give us a lift? And you'd get one on each corner. I used to sit here.
So there.
Yeah, this is where
That was
sat.
your spot.
There was a platform there, and
Yeah.
the podium would have been there in the middle, and I would sit
Right.
here. It was here, and I'm sitting here, and all I can hear after about 10 minutes is the squeaking door slamming as somebody got up and left. And after about half an hour, I turned and I looked round, and there's only me and the lecturer still in the room. And because there were those 2 double doors and the other 2 double doors, there was no way I could get out until the end, when the porter, when he knew the lecture had finished, used to come and open the doors for me. So I was stuck. But oh, it was so nice to see original doors. Takes me back. These are the original doors.
The original doors.
Yeah. Yeah, I had many a happy hour struggling with them. And I used to call this corridor Puncture Alley
Punch Alley.
because, well, I used pneumatic tyres, and all the notice boards were there, and people would just rip the notices off the board, and quite often there would be drawing pins, and if you missed one, bet your life you'd run over it. When I signed up to do my PhD, I wanted to do something on looking at the way epilepsy was managed in Borstals and prisons, because when I was teaching in the Borstal, I'd met a number of inmates who were diagnosed as epileptics, and they used to regularly have fits in my classroom, but I never knew anybody outside the walls of the prison or the institution who had epilepsy, and I never saw a fit or anything. So there was a problem there, and I wanted to investigate this. I was just going to read stuff around criminology and what was then called the sociology of deviance, but I had to broaden it out, and I had to read quite a lot of stuff on medical sociology as well, and other, stuff around psychology of disability and so on. And literally, I couldn't. When I kind of got into that literature, I couldn't believe, again how individual model focused it all was. It was all about impairment and even the sociology, which you'd have thought would have been about structure and barriers and so on, was very much about starting from medical definitions of impairment and kind of building out from there. rather than you start the other way around. You start from social structures and then you build back to what can we do in order to improve the lives of individuals. So that kind of changed my thinking. Without that, who knows? I might never have been got into disability studies. I might never have invented the term, the social model. I might have been a criminologist instead.
And then what happened after? So you left Kent, right, after your PhD?
Well, I finished my PhD in 78.
Yeah.
And I actually spent the next 9 months looking for a full-time job. But in the meantime, I was doing part-time teaching I'd done some teaching for the adult education department at the University of Kent. I was also, by this time, working for the Open University because they'd got a course called The Handicapped Person in the Community. So I was teaching on that. And I was also doing occasional fill-in and teaching work at the Borstal institution where I'd been previously. But because by this time I had a young family, I needed a full-time job. And I spent 9 months soul-destroyingly looking for a job and, finding the same kind of prejudice that existed in the 60s. Nothing had really changed, except that I'd changed in that I now had 6 years of a solid work record behind me. I also had an undergraduate degree and a postgraduate degree, but it didn't make me any more employable. I stuck it out, and then in 1979, the University of Kent managed to get a grant to run a course it was based on a report that the governing body for social work at the time had done called People with Disabilities Need Better Trained Social Workers. And so the University of Kent had put in this proposal to run a master's degree in social work with disabled people, which was a post-qualifying course. So it was for qualified social workers who wanted to improve their knowledge and their skills base with working specifically with disabled people. I came back to Kent and became, the course director of this, what we would now call MA in Disability Studies, but at the time was an MA in social work with disabled people.
So chronologically, we're up to the point where you wrote your first book, Social Work with Disabled People. Can you give me a little bit of a contextualization about how that came about and what your intentions were for that book?
I didn't intend to write a book, but it was based really upon the job I had as lecturer, course director for the social work with handicapped people. I didn't want the course to be about impairments. I didn't want people to come in and give a lecture on this is spinal injury and this is multiple sclerosis and this is motor neurons and so forth. So I wanted it to be much more kind of socially focused and relevant to what social workers and other professionals, because quite a lot of people that came on the course were occupational therapists, were actually doing in their day-to-day practice. And I also wanted to incorporate as much as I could of disabled people's experiences into the course. So those were the kind of drivers, and that's the way I kind of built the syllabus, and that's the kind of things I talked to about students. And of course, they were quite grounded, most of them, in practice, in what they were doing. And I had the advantage that although my appointment was primarily at the university, I was also contracted 1 day a week to work for Kent Social Services Department. So I was grounded in another way, in that I was seeing, issues from the point of view of a service provider as well. So I wanted to find a way of kind of incorporating all that into A, what I was teaching, and then B, when I was approached to write a book on the course about the topic, to incorporate that all that into the book. And so that's really how about this kind of dichotomy between what I call the individual and the social model came about. Not everybody makes the transition from impairment consciousness to disability consciousness, if you like. And if that's the reality of what social workers are doing, then that's the reality you have to deal with. But I did want to provide an alternative, more optimistic picture, which wasn't about simply seeing disability as personal tragedy, disabled people as unemployable and so on, and that it was about having an optimistic view of what disabled people could achieve if many of the barriers that they faced were removed. And so that's how the teaching came about. That was my philosophy for the course, if you like, which I hammered out with my student colleagues and with my colleagues at Kent Social Services. And then when I was asked to write a book, I merely incorporated all that into the book. And it seems to have obviously resonated with lots of people, because 35 years down the road, although it's in its 4th edition, it's actually still in print and it still sells. So there must be things in it that resonate still today.
All right, well, let's jump to the 90s then and talk about your other book, The Politics of Disablement.
Since I'd done my PhD, I'd had this kind of other book in my head that I wanted to write, which was about looking at sociology and looking at disability and trying to bring the two together in a meaningful way. Previously, I'd been teaching for the Open University on a course called The Handicapped Person in the Community. But that had to be rewritten every 5 years. That was part of the OU's charter. And in the second and the third rewrites, I had written some sociological units for the course. And that's when I kind of started looking at other societies to see how they handled and so on. So all that kind of thinking was going into my head, and the politics of disablement emerged. But it was never an attempt to kind of simply take the social model further. It was an attempt to apply sociology and sociological principles to our understandings of disability. Again, I suppose you could say I was in the right place at the right time, because disability studies was about to kind of take off and become what it is now. And it was almost like the politics of disablement became the marquee text for that. But again, that wasn't something that I'd planned. I hadn't planned to kind of produce this textbook and then, kind of like some kind of educational entrepreneur. It happened at the right time. The book was there. People were beginning to think about moving on from the OU and from the experience of the course at Canterbury to look at ways in which disability studies could be meaningfully incorporated into university curricula up and down the country. And the book was there, and so people made use of it.
You did spend a lot of time in the book exploring possibilities for the future of the disability movement, some of which actually have come to pass since. So one of the recommendations you made was for an effective anti-discrimination legislation, one that focused on social rights and not individual needs. But then, of course, 5 years later, the Disability Discrimination Act, came into force.
The first thing to say, though, is I didn't and don't regard the Disability Discrimination Act as a kind of important piece of legislation. But I was involved in establishing in winning the argument that we needed anti-discrimination legislation, because through BCODP, which the British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, which was a collection of organisations controlled and run by disabled people, that was one of our key platforms, that we needed proper anti-discrimination legislation. And the government had always set its face against that. It had convened a committee which met in the early 80s called the Committee on Restrictions Against Disabled People, which recommended anti-discrimination legislation and said discrimination was widespread against disabled people. But the government refused to accept it and refused to believe it and set its face against creating the legislation. So I, with a number of others, we had this idea that if we actually took government statistics and used them to prove that all these barriers that we've been talking about in theory did actually exist in practice, the government would find it much more difficult to refute the argument. And so I wrote this proposal to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to undertake a 2-year research project in which we would, through BCODP, we would employ a research officer who would look at all the government stats that were produced at the time about disability in education, in health, in employment and so on. And they would produce this book which would demonstrate that discrimination clearly did exist. And Rowntree gave us the money to do that. And we appointed a man called Colin Barnes, and his book, Discrimination Against Disabled People in Britain, came out in 1991. And it did effectively change the government's position, because from the following year, government were then saying, we don't dispute that discrimination is widespread, but we're still not convinced that anti-discrimination legislation is the way ahead. Now, the big charities will tell you that they then got on board and they lobbied the government and the government changed. But the reality was, it was the Direct Action Network and action on the streets. If you remember in the 90s, people chained themselves to buses. London was clogged up on several occasions. We managed to stop telethon from going out after 1992, all because disabled people were taking direct action onto the streets. But even then, when eventually the government decided it would introduce its own bill, to which eventually became the Disability Discrimination Act, in my view, they still sold disabled people an hour aims for that legislation down the river, in that it adopted a medical definition. It made the legislation virtually unenforceable, and it proved ineffective. But it did have one very negative effect, unfortunately, which was to split the disability movement, because some people in the movement thought it's the best we're going to get. Therefore, we have to join in, we have to become members of the Disability Rights Task Force, we have to work with the government in order to make it work. We know it's not what we wanted, but it's the best we're going to get for now. Let's work with it and do what we can. And there are others of us, and I was in the other camp, who said, no, it's crap. We've spent 15 years building up a very strong, powerful power base. We've got a good lobby. We've got the Direct Action Network, who terrified the life out of politicians in the 90s, because, and there were a couple of examples of where they turned up in various constituencies and did actually affect the results of elections and so on. So, but that wasn't the view that held sway. And virtually the movement split. And although it kind of staggered on for a few years after that, it was never the same after the DDA was passed. So not only did we end up, in my view, getting a crap piece of legislation, but it did untold damage to the disabled people's movement at the same time. What we had in the period from 79 to 95 was what I call disability activism. And that's when the movement controlled and run by disabled people was active, it was passionate, it was based on pride. What's happened, and ironically since 97 when Blair took over, is that disability corporatism has replaced disability activism. And the big charities have reinvented themselves, and they now call themselves the disability movement, which is why I always try and talk about the difference between the disability movement and the disabled people's movement. And I don't see disability corporatism, I don't see the Disability Rights UK and scope and all that, although they've changed their names and so on. They are just corporate entities who are only concerned in promoting themselves, like most corporate entities are. And as I say, that's the process that's been going on since '97. And disability organisations of disabled people have been starved of funds and have lost contracts because of all that, because they are now the ones that are regarded by governments of all shapes and sizes as the authentic view of disabled people, when of course they represent nobody but themselves. The whole kind of activist process, if you like, has been shifted away from disability pride. We are disabled people, we are proud of that, we don't want to change our identities, into what I call it, under disability corporatism, special pleading. That we've now moved to special pleading because basically what these organisations now say is, please don't be nasty to disabled people, because this personal tragic thing has happened to them and they need all the benefits and all the support so they can get. So we are in, we have been moved back to where we were, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when I first started out on this kind of intellectual and academic activist journey, if you like. And what I would say is that I'm clear, and I always have been clear, if we don't do it for ourselves, then society will get it wrong. Whatever their motivations, whatever their interests, as I said to you before, if we'd have left it to well-meaning, able-bodied people in the 60s, we'd all be living in nice institutions, looking out on beautiful countryside, but doing bugger all. If we leave it to well-meaning professionals now, we'll all have comfortable lives in the community, but we won't be doing all the things that other people take for granted. We won't be taking risks. We won't be autonomous about, our futures. We won't be autonomous about even everyday things like when we get up in the morning and when we go to bed at night and all that nonsense, because we know from the history of the last 100 years that whatever their intentions, whatever their motivations, when able-bodied people do it for us, they get it wrong 100% of the time.